My name is Ben Gilbert. I'm a cybersecurity advisor with the Department of Homeland Security's Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. I'm going to talk to you all today about third-party risk, best practices when we're managing risks with our external dependencies, and a little bit about what that is. So hopefully you all were able to see our fireside chat with Director Easterly this morning. She mentioned a lot about what our agency does. Essentially, we are the nation's cyber defender. We are focusing on managing, reducing risks to our nation's digital and physical critical infrastructure. What isn't often mentioned is a part of the way we do this at CISA is we have part of the way is a regional presence across the country. We have aligned to the 10 different FREME regions that are out there, and particularly when it comes to efforts such as partnership development and capacity building, because everything that we do at CISA really weighs and hinges on that, our ability to partner and collaborate with both public and private sector partners. A part of the way we do that is through that regional presence. And so we have, through each region, we have a number of operational staff associated with it. So we have cybersecurity advisors like myself out there. Now we're upwards of about 65 cybersecurity advisors across the country. We also have what we call protective security advisors that are focused on guards, gates, guns, active shooter training, and so forth. We have emergency communications coordinators that are also focused on interoperability of emergency communications equipment, and we have our we have our chemical security inspectors. That is our very, very small sliver of regulatory space that CISA has. But all in all, CISA is largely a voluntary agency. We are not law enforcement. We are not a regulator in that sense of regulating any particular sector and so forth. So we have to be very collaborative and have that form those strong partnerships with our public and private sector partners that are out there. So Director Easterly mentioned briefly Cybersecurity Awareness Month. Everybody in here should know that October is Cybersecurity Awareness Month. Just out of curiosity, how many of you, can I ask, who knows how long Cybersecurity Awareness Month has been going on for? Does anyone know? So 19 years, believe it or not. Cybersecurity Awareness Month, and it started through the Department of Homeland Security, and years after year we've been pushing that effort. This year in particular has been a very big year. Obviously the President signed a proclamation to formally announce October is Cybersecurity Awareness Month, which is great. A lot has been happening this year on Cybersecurity Awareness Month. CISA put out our strategic plan. We also announced the very first federal workforce, I think it was State of Review, if I recall correctly, that really talked a bit about what the reality is, the deficit of the cybersecurity workforce across our country. And believe it or not, it's upwards of 700,000 nationally. So that's a lot and has been continuously growing over the years. And just in the public sector alone, so state, local, and federal government, we're looking at about 40,000 cybersecurity professionals, that deficit that we're actively hiring for now. So huge piece, and the reason why we say this year, see yourself in cyber, because the reality is everybody in an organization has a role in cybersecurity, including focusing, ensuring your multi-factor authentication is enabled, focusing on phishing campaign awareness and so forth that are up there. But that's not why we're here today. We're here to talk about managing external dependencies. So what does that mean? So external dependencies are basically organizations and entities that your organization is externally reliant on to be able to carry out a particular service or product or so forth that are out there. This includes those that are in your supply chain, so your vendors, your service providers, your governmental service providers that are out there. All of those various organizations that are in your supply chain your IT and communication supply chain. Those external dependencies oftentimes have connections to your internal networks and your infrastructure and your processes, your internal business processes. They oftentimes have partly control of that ownership of some of those different activities and services that are provided in your organization. So why manage external dependencies? Why do we need to care about this? Obviously, there are a lot of inherent risks when you're having to rely on an entity that's external to your organization that you don't have a lot of control over. And these are just examples. Obviously, probably the earlier, more widely known one, Target, data breach that was carried out through their HVAC vendor. Obviously, Log4j, huge risk area when it comes to your external dependencies that are out there. SolarWinds attack, obviously this was, first and, top front of the news and still to this day probably one of the frankly most significant threats to, and realization of the risk area with our external dependency partners. We heard earlier, I think yesterday or the day before, from SolarWinds regarding this. Then obviously you have external dependencies that are hardware manufacturers and so forth, manufacturing chipsets in other parts of the world that are out there, some of which are more adversarial countries potentially that we have to worry about. And so we have to worry about some of the motivations and aspects from those various vendors that are out there when it comes to our external dependencies and our vendors and through that supply chain. So when we're talking about managing disruptions and so forth, and this actually, one of the things that we provide at CISA is a number of different assessments. One of the assessments that we have is what we call the External Dependencies Management Assessment. This is actually, we've based that assessment off of this principle. Essentially, when we're talking about critical services, critical functions and so forth, Director Easterly alluded to the national critical functions earlier this morning, but if you delve even a little deeper into national critical functions, you're talking about at the organizational level, different services that enable that organization to be able to carry out its mission. So at the top level, you have different services. Some of these are supportive in nature. Some of these are critical and core operational services that directly enable and carry out that organization's mission. Each of those services have a number of different business processes and operations associated with it, and each of those operations and business processes have technology associated with it. So hardware, software, your enterprise IT, your operational technology, all helping to provide those operations to be able to carry out that service. You also have information that flows through that different technology. Some of that information is directly operational information, telemetry information. Some of that is very sensitive PII related information. Some of it's configuration information. We also have people that own and operate that technology, and we also have the facilities that all of that technology and the people are housed in and so forth. All of that, you can certainly draw a box around that and map it and point it to a key critical service that directly supports your organization's mission. So now when we're talking about business disruptions and so forth, so what's key here is that each one of these different asset types can be managed by external dependencies. Your people, obviously you have contract support and so forth that you've contracted to be able to carry out some of those services. You have various vendors, information holders and so forth of that information. You have technology providers that are out there, your MSPs, your MSSPs and so forth. You have your facility owners and operators, particularly if you're leasing those facilities and so forth. So you have external dependencies that your organizations are reliant on, in part to be able to carry out your mission. And so if there is a disruption with any of that technology, particularly when it comes to your external dependencies, so for instance, if your vendor got hit with ransomware, well, that has an immediate impact on your operations. And then that actually has an immediate impact on the ability to carry out that service, which then has an immediate impact to be able to carry out your organization's mission, a potential impact to that. So it's critical to be able to understand what those risk factors are with your external dependencies that are out there. This is just an example of some of those different external dependencies are that are out there. So you have different data processors and so forth, data providers. Some of this could be, again, telemetry data that's coming from the outside in. Some of this is maybe payment processing data, financial services data. Some of this is website data, third-party data, and so forth. Your telecommunications, obviously, different telecommunication systems. Even your local law enforcement, fire and EMS services. All of these are external dependencies potentially to your organization. So for instance, if you have a data center and a fire breaks out in that server room and so forth, does your local fire department know not to go in there, fire hoses blazing, that they have different methods and so forth to be able to put out that fire and extinguish that fire? You want to be able to have those conversations with your local police department, your local fire departments and so forth that are in there, and that's just one example of that. So what's the right approach? Well, obviously we're talking about risk-based approach, third-party risk. So a part of that third-party risk-based approach is having a strategy or a plan, an approach to be able to manage risks related to your external dependencies. This approach also includes a process for identifying and prioritizing your external dependencies, to be able to monitor and track those external dependencies. A key part of any business is being able to identify what your services are, what services that your organization provides. And a part of that process is also identifying what external dependencies enable you to provide that service. Guidance and procedures on the formation of the relationships with your external dependency partners that are out there, as well as an approach for managing and governing existing external dependencies that are out there, as well as ongoing oversight and reporting and correction of external entities and their performance. So this is just an example of one of those, I'd say, a resilience-focused methodology and approach. We actually worked with a number of the different things that we do at CISA. We have what's called the Cyber Resilience Review assessments. And a part of that assessment methodology and what it's based off of is this resilience, this methodology that we've borrowed and leveraged from the financial services industry. This is something that we've worked with the financial services industry on to be able to build this repeatability, this approach and so forth. And we've taken this model and applied it to an approach to be able to manage your external dependencies. So it starts off with being able to, again, identify your key critical services within your organization. Once you've identified those key critical services, to be able to identify your assets, to include your external dependencies and map those external dependencies to what is being provided within your organization. That enables you to be able to prioritize which one of your vendors is most critical to your operations. From there, putting in various controls and to be able to protect and to sustain your operations, including disruption and managing those disruptions through incident management processes and so forth. Not just incident response planning, but incident management planning. Then bringing in your external entities as a part of that conversation. And then, of course, conducting various exercises and so forth to be able to play out the ability to be able to how successful your incident management planning efforts are. So when we're talking about this repeatability encourages process maturity, which enables that operational resilience. And so when we're talking about that repeatability, particularly when it comes to external dependencies management, and again, this is based, when we formed the external dependencies management assessment at CISA, we wanted to be able to form it based off the life cycle of that relationship and that partnership with your external dependencies. So what that relationship, what that life cycle looks like from the point when you formed that that partnership with your external entity to being able to actively manage what that external dependency is doing and so forth, how they're actively protecting their environment in order to be able to protect your operations, and then also on the left side there, service protection and sustainment. So what are you doing as an organization to ensure that your operations are protected and sustained when your external dependencies are experiencing disruption? So when you look at this, you start to be able to build that repeatability and approach, so having documentation and so forth to be able to formalize and build and codify those business processes as a part of that life cycle, if you will, of managing external dependencies. So starting off with relationship formation. So for instance, do you as an acquirer of that service and that dependency evaluate the control and risks, your external dependencies, before entering into those agreements with them? So again, identifying your key critical services, what's most critical to your operations, and being able to identify the risk areas of those. That enables you to understand what's your higher priority entities that are out there, your external entities. Understanding your most critical services, again, having processes for entering into those formal agreements. So do you have a boilerplate template of baseline security requirements that you can apply to each and every vendor that's out there? And evaluating your external entities against that boilerplate security requirements list and so forth. What are the minimum set of security requirements that your organization requires in order to be able to form that agreement and that relationship with your external entities? Now, obviously, some agreements that you can require that formation before you form that relationship with them. Other times, not as much, right? So when you're thinking about things to be able to make it actionable, so actions you can take that you can implement today, or take back to your organization and be able to implement. So being able to establish and document your most critical business functions. Inventory the assets and dependencies that support those different functions and services and so forth. So having an inventory of your people, your information, your technology, and your facilities. Map it back to those critical services, map it back to those external entities as a part of that effort. And then finally, understanding the objectives of your controls. Not just understanding your controls that you have in place, but what's the objective you're trying to achieve with those controls. So for instance, with your people, with your contractors, support, and so forth, does your organization require background checks of those individuals? Does that contractor require background checks of those individuals? So why is that important? What is the objective you're actually trying to achieve with having those background and checks in place, right? You're trying to essentially achieve to determine how trustworthy those individuals are at working your organization and whether there's any concerns and so forth with their background that you have to worry about. So does having that initial background check up front, is that enough to be able to succeed in that control objective that you're trying to apply? Or do you need to maybe increase your background checks and so forth to maybe biannual, every 3 years or even annually or so forth? What is the objective you're actually trying to achieve, and does that control actually meet that objective? Same thing with technology and so forth. So if you're trying to protect your data in a confidential manner, enabling encryption. So what type of encryption is required in order to be able to accomplish that objective? So having those objectives and understanding your control objectives in place. Forming those relationships based on a plan, ensuring the right people are a part of the process when you're doing so. Oftentimes your procurement office is typically responsible for forming those relationships and those partnerships, which is great, but you want to be able to also include Within that conversation, your security directors, so that they can be able to build that baseline and that baseline boilerplate language, those baseline security requirements that can apply to each and every different vendor that's out there. Again, documenting those requirements as a part of that process, having formal contractual requirements in place as a part of that process as well. Have a risk management process in place. So many organizations have risk managers installed and have a formal risk management process in place. Oftentimes that risk manager is usually focused on financial risk or compliance risk or maybe even regulatory risk and so forth. Not often is that individual or that risk management program focused on operational risk or looking at cyber risk or looking at risk of your external dependencies. So talk with your risk managers and so forth if you have them. If you don't, consider looking at building that risk management process, having that, again, that repeatability and that repeatable process and approach, being able to identify those various risk areas, analyze those risks and dispose of that risk, whether you're going to accept that risk, transfer that risk, implement various controls and so forth, to be able to mitigate various risks that are there. Being able to deploy those various controls and monitor those existing controls that are in place to see if they are actually doing the job that you put those controls in there, and are they meeting those control objectives that you put in place to be able to buy down that risk. Involving your dependencies in this risk management process. So also, something to take back as well, evaluate your potential dependencies against your requirements. Again, having that boilerplate list of security requirements that all of your vendors and your external dependencies need to meet. And then when you start to form those relationships with them and those contracts, are those contracts in place? Are they actually meeting those security requirements that you've established? Again, consider meeting those security requirements, verify that they're meeting with them, evaluate their own dependencies and so forth. If they are not, or if they can't, for instance, the contractual agreements you have in place are unable to meet those your security requirements, then your organization has a decision to make to be able to accept that risk, right? Or deploy additional controls, compensating controls that could be able to cover those gaps as a part of that risk management process. Again, meeting your requirements, managing the dependencies, and managing vulnerabilities, incidents, and risks as a part of that effort. Evaluate your technology against your requirements. Do they adhere to criteria or standards that can be considered trusted? Again, these are questions to be able to ask. Do they similarly have trusted suppliers as a part of that? Is acceptance testing done with your various vendors and your external entities? So now we're going to talk about relationship management and governance. So we talked about forming that relationship with your external dependencies, whether or not they're able to meet those boilerplate security requirements that you've established for every one of your external entities that are out there. Now we're talking about how you actively manage and govern that external dependency. So a lot of this is repeatable. I will caveat this to say this is not my slide deck. I actually had to step in at the last minute with one of our folks. He had an emergency he had to deal with, so he actually couldn't make it this week. So they called me in to step in here. So not my slides. I'll caveat that. Do you actively manage your risk related to various dependencies that are out there? Do you manage supplier performance? Are supplier transitions being managed? So are you actively managing your suppliers and the activities they're being able to carry out? For instance, do they have a shared account to be able to remote into your operations? Or for every one of their vendors, do they have their own individual account? So you have that non-repudiation, that you can be able to point directly back at an individual and have that individual accountable as opposed to a shared account with your vendors. Is change capacity and capacity management process applied to those dependencies. So if you have, for instance, a cloud provider, and that cloud provider is running at capacity, and now you have bandwidth issues and load issues as it relates to that vendor that's out there, is that being addressed and actively monitored? Do you have agreements in place that could be able to address those various capacity issues that you might potentially experience? Are governmental and infrastructure dependencies managed? Again, we had that slide up that talked about your governmental service providers and so forth that are out there, not just your fire, EMS, and law enforcement, but your telecom providers, even your governmental infrastructure providers and so forth. Some organizations are reliant on the local IT infrastructure to enable their operations and so forth. What does that relationship look like with those entities? Oftentimes you can't control what protective measures and so forth those entities have in place, but at the very least you could identify and build that relationship with those entities and so forth, particularly when it comes to law enforcement or your third-party providers and so forth, your telecom providers. So again, in the event that they experience a disruption to their operations, so if cell phone service or something goes down and you're heavily reliant on that, then you've already formed that relationship with them. You know what those expectations are before that event occurs, that incident occurs, and then you could be able to, then you can pivot your operations accordingly because you're already aware of that. Again, making it actionable, identify and prioritize your most critical suppliers, infrastructure providers, governmental services that are out there. Maintain a process for maintaining a list and relevant information that external entity needs. So for your cloud provider and so forth, what information do they need from you to be able to enable that, that service appropriately? Are they your MSSP, or is that just assumed that they have security controls in place to be able to meet your requirements and so forth? Monitor, manage supply risk continuously in cooperation with that provider and so forth. Again, so it's this process, this repeatable process to be able to consistently monitor and manage their performance and their risks with those organizations and so forth. Review and update those requirements accordingly, at least annually, if you can. A lot of the contractual agreements, particularly with the federal government, are oftentimes in a 5-year life cycle and so forth. So sometimes it can be a little more difficult. But again, having that ability to review at least annually and to be able to form those updates and so forth within those agreements as appropriate and as what's allowable. Document supplier performance and effective corrective actions, and verify requirements continue to be captured in those agreements. Also, having a coordinated change management process in place with those dependencies that covers the relevant, again, people, information, technology, and facilities, having that understanding of what that process looks like, so that, for instance, if your contractor is underperforming, what ability do you have as an organization to switch out that contractor to be able to get either the right higher performer or a proper skill set in place? Monitor and participate in contract negotiations to help manage impacts, capacity issues, etc. So being able to have those monitoring elements in place. Again, working with your procurement office and understanding and form that relationship with them. Understand what goes into those contracts and those agreements, those SLAs and so forth. Do those SLAs also take a look at your security requirements and agreements that you have with them? Do they meet what your needs are as an organization? Can you go back and update those and continuously manage those various agreements and those contracts that you have in place? Monitor for organizational changes like buyouts and so forth. So if there is a buyout what does that do to your your security posture? Are you losing a capability as a result of that buyout, or are you gaining a capability? Or if, for instance, one of your vendors goes bankrupt tomorrow, do you have an alternate that you've already identified that meets your security requirements, or do you have to go to the drawing board and start from scratch? So we talked about relationship formation. We also talked about maintaining and monitoring your external dependencies. Now we're going to talk about critical service protection and sustainment. So do you include external dependencies into your disruption management plans? How many actually have continuity of operations planning, DR planning, continuity planning in place? And do you include your external dependencies as a part of those conversations and as part of your exercising those various planning efforts and your DR planning efforts? Are your controls related to the dependencies maintained and updated? Do you share situation awareness with external dependencies? So when you're ingesting various threat intelligence feeds that are out there, do you have a mechanism to be able to share some of those threat intelligence feeds with your external dependencies? What does that relationship potentially look like? Can you do that? Also including threat intelligence feeds from law enforcement elements and so forth, fusion centers that are out there. What does what do those threat feeds look like, and can you actively share them out? Or vulnerabilities and so forth. So if you've identified a vulnerability with your vendor products and so forth, Log4j for instance, are they addressing that? Are they addressing those types of vulnerabilities within their systems? What does that agreement look like to be able to provide those patches in their operating environments to enable the proper protections in your environment? Yes, sir.
Are there any resources for the little guys in terms of public or private sector where you get a lot of these common or shared dependencies where people are looking at the same thing? So if some of that risk analysis has been done, or if there's something that can be inherited, whether it's like internet service provider or utility, or those as dependencies, not as the where someone wouldn't have to do all this work every single time.
Yeah, that's a very good question. I don't have it built into the deck. Maybe it's a good time to, I guess, put a plug in for some of the resources that CISA provides and so forth. A number of the different resources that we have out there. In fact, if you go to our website, there's actually this is part of, I think, the Cybersecurity Awareness Month. It's also a part of the campaign we held earlier in the year, talk about our Shields Up campaign and so forth. Part of that effort was to be able to publicize free services that are available. A lot of these services are CISA provides. Some of these services are a lot of those vendor managed services that we've actually formed an alliance with as a part of our JCDC effort and so forth up there. There's a huge laundry list of services, free services that are up there, low cost services, particularly for those smaller businesses that lack the resources and capability. So take a look at that. That would be a good starting point, I'd say, to be able to take a look at that. Frankly, there's hundreds of resources that are available out there, and we've tried to be able to form those accordingly on our website. So as another plan of action, making things actionable again, plan for disruptions. So having that disruption management planning in place, have an incident management plan in place, again, not just incident response planning, but how you actively manage incidents. What are the preparedness efforts that go into managing incidents? Who are all of the different components within your organization that you need to be able to bring in to be able to appropriately manage incidents? Ransomware is a great example of this because it's so potentially disruptive to organizations. When an organization gets hit by ransomware, it oftentimes very quickly goes well beyond your IT and your IT security and goes right up to the top of your chain. And that's where your business leaders start making business-like decisions on how to be able to move forward with business operations and so forth. So bring those folks into your incident management planning efforts. Even third-party risk managers and so forth, your third-party incident responders, bring in law enforcement into those conversations as a part of that effort as well. Understand what their capabilities are, understand what their processes are. If you made a call on, to, for instance, FBI and said, hey, I'm dealing with a ransomware incident or I'm dealing with a APT actor, I need help. What can you help us out with? Have those conversations before and ahead of time. Bring them into your incident management planning discussions. Oop. The wrong button there. Have a service continuity, business continuity plan. Again, accounting for those dependencies. So have your external dependencies as a part of that discussion. Having your BCPs, your DRPs, and so forth specifically address your external dependencies within there. Plan and exercise, again, those dependencies as a part of that incident management process. Maintain updates and controls. Again, we talked about control objectives. So why do you have that control into place? Is it actually meeting that objective? A lot of times we like to use this graphic here that basically shows the little gate saying, okay, hey, this is a control that organization put in place to be able to manage access into that facility. But if you can drive around that gate, it's not meeting that objective that you put it in place, right? So being able to test your controls, whether or not they're meeting your objectives. Again, when changes to relationships occur, does that trigger a review of your various plans and so forth? So if you switch vendors and so forth, maybe they have different capabilities. Maybe they're not meeting your objectives anymore. So when you switch vendors, when you switch different contractors and so forth, does that trigger a formal review process of all of your other planning efforts, your incident management planning, your controls objectives planning, and so forth? Again, our controls supplier is tested and audited. So another making it accountable action, so extending situational awareness to your external dependencies. Do you have someone dedicated to monitor that threat information? So understanding where you are in the spectrum of the critical infrastructure sector that's out there, and understanding what different threat actors are potentially targeting those different critical infrastructure sectors. And are you actively monitoring threats that are targeting those potential critical infrastructure sectors that are out there? So how do you what does that threat management process look like? Are you monitoring for your own situational awareness? Are you monitoring for your external dependency situational awareness and vice versa? Do they have a situational awareness program in place that they can, again, build that relationship and that partnership? Are there standard procedures in place? Do you cooperatively include dependencies and share information? So again, forming that bi-directional partnership and that relationship, being able to build in those mechanisms to actively bi-directionally share that information, threat intelligence information, and so forth accordingly with your vendors. So that, again, the idea is you are maintaining as good of risk posture as you can and mitigating various risks as it relates to your external dependencies. Are you monitoring those threats, again, to your external dependencies? So we talked a bit about forming that relationship. We talked about maintaining and monitoring that relationship. We talked about service protection sustainment. Now we're going to talk about maturing the process. So process maturity. Again, this is based off of when we formed the external dependencies management assessment. That's actually a snippet of a larger maturity model that we've built, so what we call the Cyber Resilience Review. The Cyber Resilience Review looks across 10 different information security domains. External dependencies management was one of those, and we basically pulled it out of the CRR and expanded greatly as a part of that model, if you will. But a part of that entire model with external dependencies management, as well as our cyber resilience review, because it's so holistic looking at the organization, process maturity is huge in that entire process. And this is something we try to incorporate, we foot stomp, if you will, when we talk about external dependencies. Being able to manage those processes. So again, how well are we performing? Do you have processes in place to be able to actively monitor and maintain your external dependencies? Do you actually have a policy and a plan in place that guides those various activities? Managing cybersecurity and operational risk are capabilities in organizations that must take part in their business processes. So again, thinking about documentation. Do you have policies and plans in place? Do you have management oversight of those external dependencies? Managing the risks associated with those external dependencies. Do you have a risk manager that's looking at those as well? Is your procurement looking at those? Are they talking with each other in your organizations? How are you actively monitoring and measuring the effectiveness of the controls that you have in place to be able to buy down the risk of your external dependencies? And what does that look like? How defined is that across your entire enterprise? I keep doing that. Again, part of this, and there's a cost-benefit analysis as a part of this, right? So it's at the end of the day, this is all about managing risk. Managing risk within your organization, managing risk with your external dependencies. Just some kind of points here. Ad hoc cybersecurity is often inefficient and ineffective. Again, having that repeatable approach, having things formalized, documented, having policy and plans in place driving those activities, which also drives funding, drives resources availability and so forth, drives that repeatability. Know your risk tolerance, and knowing that risk tolerance helps you to balance risk and costs. So if you have the ability to accept that risk, that has a lot that goes a lot into the decision making with which types of organizations you could form those relationships with and so forth that are out there. You'll likely be speaking to risk, again, you'll likely be speaking with your risk managers and talking about risk management and so forth. Resilience is finding the just right level of risk management. So when we talk about resilience, it's really about the ability to, absorb disruptions and bounce back to your normal operating states. Some organizations, that means you have a very tight risk tolerance. Some organizations, that might mean you have a little looser risk tolerance, just depending on the organization, depends on the external dependency, depends on the service that your external dependencies are supporting and providing. We talked a bit briefly about this process maturity approach and so forth. This is based off of our cyber resilience review. Again, part of the approach that we took when we formed that assessment and this approach is, again, looking at this process maturity approach. So base level performance, what are your external dependencies and within your organization, are they carrying out and performing your base level capabilities and activities needed to be able to properly protect your environment? How well planned out are they? Is there a policy and planning in place? Is that driving activity? Is that also driving funding? How well managed are they? Do you have dedicated funding in place to be able to properly manage your external dependencies and manage various vulnerabilities that might exist and the risk associated with those vulnerabilities? And the risk associated with those external dependencies, how well measured are they and how well defined are they? So again, same idea, looking at particularly when it comes to the way we assess our organizations with, or assess based off of the cyber resilience review assessments and the external dependencies management assessments, it takes that maturity-based approach. So we look at, again, low-level capability and goals, how well managed and measured are they, how well performed, planned, managed, measured, and defined are they. So in closing, obviously it's incredibly important to be able to look at your risk landscape, understand what those risk areas are in your organization are, understand that you also have third-party providers and third-party dependencies that you also need to be including in your risk management process. Just another, I guess, additional slide in there. So with that said, again, I'll point back to the number of resources that are available on CISA's website. You can go to CISA.gov, point you to the Cyber Resource Hub in particular that can point you to a number of different resources to include the Cyber Resilience Review. There's a self-assessment capability in there. We also have the Cybersecurity Evaluations tool. That's a great tool that looks at different standards and capabilities that are out there and allows your organization to measure your security assurance levels against those various standards. Also built within the Cybersecurity Evaluation tool is the Cyber Resilience Review self-assessment, as well as the External Dependencies Management self-assessment. That's all built within there. And other than that, looks like I just ran out of time. Are there any questions that anybody has? I know that's a ton of information, and I know this is the very last session. Well, great. Well, thank you very much.